in the beginning of the film, and in a couple of places, I spoke very specifically about how I cannot speak for anybody else. I can only speak for myself. And the reason why I do that now is because over the years, what had happened would be that I would go in and people would ask me to speak, just like I was talking about speaking at the University of Alberta, right? Oftentimes, when I would go in and I would speak, people would think that my opinion was the only opinion out there. And a lot of times what we find, what happens a lot of times is that we have our words thrown back at other people, and we become, whether we intend to or not, we become the gatekeepers. We become what Alex Janvier calls the neo-Indian agents. We begin policing our own people because suddenly our voice becomes the new voice and the only voice. And this is the authority. And we don't need to talk to these people who are grassroots because we're talking to you and she's the authority. But that's actually not how we believe it, and that's not how we actually live it. What we believe, or what I've been taught, and if you've spent time with Joanne Saddleback, then she explains it beautifully when she says, this pole, this thing in the middle, I'm looking at it from over here, and I'm right. But you are looking at it from your perspective, and you are right. We value the other's perspective because I can only see it from this point. I can't see it from his point. And that's why we need to include other voices. So when I do that, over the last, specifically 7-8 years, prior to 7-8 years ago, before I got really involved within ceremony and really trying to understand my protocols and my life as an Indigenous person, I really did not understand that it was not a good thing to be the role model, and that I was not being, I was becoming a burden to my peers. And so I sat with elders and I started learning about what my right and my responsibility is. Oftentimes, the more time you spend with your elders, they will tell you, learn all you can and decide for yourself. We have that power within ourselves to make up our minds. And just because maybe I don't have the same credentials as others does not mean that I'm not educated, well-versed, and studied in what I'm talking about. I have the right to speak for myself, but only myself. Unless somebody hands me something and says, you speak for all, in which case I would probably say no, and I wouldn't even take the job. Because that's just not, I don't want to be anybody's go-to in order to oppress others. It's just not going to happen, not with me anyway. Other people are okay, but this is why I state over and over again, I can only speak for myself. I don't want to speak for another nation, another language group, another group. I don't want to be somebody who's based in Edmonton, who's got a Nihil and a Pitikotsan background, and trek it into Mohawk territory and start telling them what to do. It's just not cool. And so that's why I do that. Okay. So this is something I used to teach quite often when I was working in professional development. Number one, what I found a lot of times was that a lot of the art was being observed, media, everything that works about us has a tendency to be observed from an external. And there's pitfalls. There's pitfalls. We fall into these pits when you're observing from an external observation. So the first pitfall is romanticization. That idea that we're all going to be kind and loving and hugging trees and speaking to the wolves and, you know, that stuff. That's not us. We're very pragmatic people. So it's like when you get these really romanticized ideals of who we are and who we have to be in order to be heard, that's romanticism. And it's a big problem because externally you're trying to preserve our culture and assuming that it's dying. You're trying to preserve, cherry pick the pieces that you think are relevant and positive and good. And it basically puts us in a box that we cannot possibly really sustain and live and exist under. So the second one is the savage Indian. Often this one is used to justify civilizing us, to justify assimilation. We need to save you from yourselves because you're savages. This one is very, very connected to the rhetoric in and around art. It's subtle. It's subtle. What are you going to preserve? That's contemporary, that's traditional. It can't be both. We'll only take the contemporary, or we'll only preserve your culture. Do you see the problem there? There's a dynamic happening even within how our art is discussed. It's so ingrained. It's hard to get around. Again, the problem with it is that it assumes that our culture holds us back in some way. Pan-Indianism is when you dump us all together, which is why I've started very aggressively speaking to the idea that, no, I'm Cree and Métis, and I'm from this particular territory, and those are the stories I'm going to talk to, and I'm not going to go outside my territory unless I'm invited, but only to speak about what I know, not to tell you how to run your business or how to work with your Indians. So, again, Pan-Indianism is that cherry-picking thing that I was talking about. And it's also assuming that all the cultures and peoples are the same. So it's easy to oversimplify how to approach people when there's over 600 nations and over 60 languages. And identity is very tied to the language of the territory that you're in. So it also assumes that all protocols work right across the board, and that's not true. And again, that speaks to the lack of relationship that I was talking about. You need to know who your neighbors are if you want to do it respectfully. So all three of these are often reflected in current educational settings concerning Aboriginal history, cultural integration, curriculum, and attitudes in the mainstream about Indigenous issues and current events. How it plays out is Longfellow and Edward Curtis. Have you ever read a Longfellow poem about us? Oh, it's so lovely. But there's things about my culture that are astounding and beautiful and wonderful, and ceremony is incredible, and I love being who I am, but we're not Longfellow. We're just not. And Edward Curtis, a photographer in the 1800s, who took it upon himself to photograph the dying Indians before they were erased. But the thing was, as he went from nation to nation, they didn't look like the right kind of Indian. And so he had a tickle trunk of beads, breastplates, headdresses, clothes, regalia, and he dressed them up the way he thought they needed to look. So one of the most celebrated photographers for photographing Indian people is also within our community one of the most controversial because we weren't up to his standard of Indian. So the other thing we find in is that this rhetoric around we treat everybody the same, that colorblind ideology, we'll treat them all the same, not recognizing that your normal may not be our normal. Your barriers may not be our barriers. There may be a difference. And then when you look at how pan-Indianism plays out, it looks like that totem pole on the marina in Cold Lake. It's a beautiful totem pole, but from Cold Lake, we look at that and you just shake your head. A doctor bought it, forced them to put it there, and then of course every once in a while somebody makes the money repainting it, but it doesn't belong there. What's really sad is that I worked in the schools in Cold Lake, and you have Dene people, you have Cree people, and you have Métis people literally within a few miles of you. And the teachers are assigning projects around that totem pole and completely ignoring the people in their backyard. So even the native kids in Cold Lake are learning more about the West Coast than they are their own backyard and their own people. So do you see how problematic that becomes? Okay. So how I was taught art is a little bit different. I was part of what's called the Boreal Forest Institute for the Indigenous Arts. And it was around in the early 90s. And literally, I just got scooped up I was going to Canada College, taking some drawing classes, having fun. And somebody approached me and said, you need to take this course. And so how they developed their program was through mentorship. So you went into a studio with somebody like Alex Janvier, Jane Ashpatra, Joan Cardinal Schubert, Rebecca Belmore, Eddie Patra, Brian Clark, Dempsey Bob. These people taught you, but they taught you hands-on in the studio, literally for 2 weeks straight. You were mentored into an art form. And so I don't have that same viewpoint, and plus, of course, we also used a lot of Indigenous pedagogy. We worked in circles, we did things in circles. So how mentorship works is a little different. I'm an artist right now, and let's say there's an area that I want to go into, and there is an area that I want to go into, so I actually have to follow this process. I'll have to take my tobacco and my gifts and approach the person who is the master in that particular art form. Give it to them and ask, will you teach me? And when they take that tobacco, there's an unwritten rule that I am going to learn from this person, but not as an artist. I'm going to learn their craft exactly as they teach me. My ego is on the shelf. I must learn from them their thing. And then once I've learned it exactly the way they do it and exactly the way they teach it, then it's up to me to make it my own. So when you learn through this mentorship, apprenticeship type of pedagogy, what happens is you often see your teachers in your artwork. You will actually see who taught that person just by looking at their artwork. You can tell who was their teacher, what were they learning, And how did they make it their own? There's a really good example of this right in the Indian Group of Seven. I used to work with Alex Janvier in his gallery on the marina before he moved it on to Cold Lake First Nations. And one day Alex was talking about the Indian Group of Seven, and I was trying to get a bunch of articles together, trying to get them coordinated and stuff. And he said something in passing that piqued my interest. And he said that Carl Ray was a helper to Norval Morrisseau. And in our community, helper means two different things. There's a helper, as in, somebody who's going to help you with stuff, but there's also another form of helper. It's like an amiskwaciy, somebody who is going to be learning from you, somebody who's your helper, passing on this traditional way of doing stuff. And I said helper, and I asked him to clarify, and he agreed that I was talking about this more sacred spiritual agreement between the two. And so if you look at Carl Ray's work, his early work, it looks almost exactly like Morrisseau's, because he was being mentored and apprenticed under Morrisseau. As you get further along in his career, it changes significantly. The colors change, the lines change. And Alex said that he started telling his own stories. And that's something you can actually track about this, that this actually exists. I hate the fact that Carl Ray died so young, because I would love to see where he would have gone. But this is one of those situations, and it still happens in our community like this, that we will take youngers, we will pull them alongside us and teach them right to the end, and then we expect them to do it. And we expect them to do it their own way. They're not allowed to just copy us anymore. They have to have their own voice, tell their own stories, find their own passion. And so we already talked about this. Back one? Yeah. So this is the TRC call to action, number 82. And it says, a mandatory teaching of the history of residential schools should be put into place by the government to educate future generations about this piece of Canadian history. Dropping down, Aboriginal artists should be given the opportunity to design monuments, create ways of raising awareness through the arts. This is the call to action. But in all honesty, this is where we need to start having this conversation about inclusion. A lot of our artists just do not have that ability to do public art on this scale. They need to be mentored, and they need to be apprenticed. And that means a very different approach to how are we going to fill this call.
Intergenerational trauma. Yes, we know it. It's in our blood. The memories of trauma run through our veins. Many of our people refer this as blood memory or soul wound. The Indian residential schools, the 60s scoop, this indeed is a systematic dispossession of the human right to transfer love and happiness. The low fluency of our Indigenous languages is not our fault. It's not a loss. It has been a systemic dispossession. We live it, our parents lived it, their parents, and we pray and hope our children don't. There can't be any reconciliation until there is truth. Truth is, 1 in 5 mainstream Canadians receive university degrees. 1 in 5. While only 1 in about 33 to perhaps even upwards to 40 Aboriginal people receive university degrees. 9 in 10 Aboriginal men have been incarcerated at least one time in their life. Aboriginal people are more likely to go to prison than university. More likely to be homeless, the most likely to be homeless in our own homeland. The least likely to be homeowners in our own mother country. Aboriginal women are more impoverished than any other group, and by 5 to 7 times are more likely to die violent deaths. Truth, these are the truths. Truth is, we are so very much more than the oppression in the statistics.
Why we decided to put that in there is because a lot of times when we are sitting at tables and people are asking us for information, and we bring up information like that, people are very offended. And they're offended because they think that we're talking down about ourselves, or that we are not being positive. But at the same time, we're recognizing that this is the reality. We're not saying this to play into stereotypes. We're letting people know that this is part of the reason why there are barriers. So some of the barriers that we have, for some of us, like I said, I can't speak for all, not everybody has these barriers. There are people whose families have managed to get into the mainstream and had a lot of opportunities and gotten the education. They don't have these barriers. But according to those statistics, there are a lot of artists who are completely unrecognized because of these barriers. Number one, the classification of art into those two binaries, traditional and contemporary. I myself no longer call myself a contemporary Aboriginal artist. I call myself a Cree Métis artist. I'm done with the contemporary ideas. Anybody who looks at my artwork, spends time with my artwork, has been through my installations, knows that I'm obviously got some contemporary leanings in my artwork. But I'm tired of having to justify my work because I use ceremony, because I use the things that I use, or it has a certain aesthetic. So there's certain processes that filter out in the Indigenous pedagogy and epistemology, right? So what you actually end up seeing sometimes is something that is really just beads and feathers. It's what we call beads and feathers. It's really got very little to do with us and everything to do with what other people's constructions of us are. So 1 in 33 Indigenous people receive university degrees. When you look at the level of poverty, you also look at certain things that are just not accessible, certain technologies, certain things are just, it's just not going to happen. 2 years ago, I was homeless, and people were expecting me to put in applications for grants. How? Half an hour at a time at the Edmonton Public Library? When my computer crashed, it took me 6 months to get it back up. By then, I'd lost all my opportunities. So there's a certain assumption nowadays of a technological assumption that everybody's got access to it. No. And there's a very good possibility that some of our best artisans haven't got access to it. I did the Walrus Talks back in 2015, and I worked with over 30 artists. Most of them, some of them we brought in, we brought in people like Adrian Stinson and Tanya Luton, Linkletter, and that was easy to work with. But we also brought in grassroots artists, 20 of them, asking them to do the work, to make a submission, even if it was just simple, became a huge barrier. And it became a bone of contention between myself and the people that I was working with. Because they had these expectations that these people could drop everything and give them what they wanted right now. And sometimes it wasn't that simple. Sometimes all they had was a pay and talk, and they were out of minutes. You know, so we have a problem with the literacy sometimes. Poverty is a huge problem. It's a huge problem. So many people do not know what it looks like, what it feels like, what it is to be homeless. And yet they have these expectations that my homeless priorities are going to be the same as yours. They're not. My homeless priorities is feeding and clothing and getting a roof over my kids' heads. That's my homeless priorities. So if I'm looking around trying to navigate what I'm supposed to be doing as an artist, and also try to keep my kids from being apprehended, I'm sorry, your email is not as important to me. The last barriers right here, number one, supplies, decent supplies. That's always a problem. When you have to choose between groceries and having the right kind of canvas and having decent paint, and I'm sure I see a lot of people nodding, supplies is an issue. It's an even worse issue when you're homeless. Appropriate technology. We have got some kids who are amazing with digital art forms, and they just do not have access, period, to the technologies that they need. And if they did, oh my God. Places to create that are affordable. There's just really a serious shortage there. There's no place to create for Indigenous artists at this time. They're trying to develop something, but I don't believe that it would be really inclusive. I think there needs to be more than just one. I think there needs to be layers. And then, of course, actually having the time to create, to sit down and do what you do. That's very difficult when you're working two part-time, low minimum wage jobs. And so these are the things that we just wanted to talk about and bring forward. Put it on the radar. And like I said, we're not the only ones. We're not the gatekeepers. This is what we see. There are others out there. And I'd encourage you to find others to speak to. And if you could, create some kind of a community. Kayasego in the 1970s, right up to the 1960s or 1990s, there was an organization called the Indian Arts and Crafts Society of Alberta, which closed in 1996. That was an artist-run, artist-focused organization that worked. And it was really unfortunate that it got gutted through the Mulroney administration. But if you want to look at something, if you want to go into your own history, because the AFA actually is quite connected with that organization, so go within your own history and find out what were we doing that worked, and what do we need to do to expand on that work. Sometimes our stuff just gets buried because the funding priorities change. We bury good work all the time. Start digging it up.